Working. I'm Nora Firm from USAID's Global Climate Change Office. John Furlow is not here this week. He's Caribbean somewhere, so I'm standing in for him. It's my pleasure to introduce Spencer Reeder, who will be presenting this afternoon's talk. Spencer is the lead on climate programs at Cascadia Consulting in Seattle, and he's been working on climate change related policy and programs for about 2 decades in the private sector, in the public sector, and what else? No, it's not. He has an MS in Aerospace Engineering Sciences and a BS in Chemical Engineering, and he is transitioning to an exciting new role at Paul Allen's Vulcan Philanthropic Initiatives, where he'll be the new lead on climate work there. But he'll still be a strategic advisor to us on this program under the Climate Change Development. He has to leave for the airport at 5 o'clock, so we'll still leave time for Q&A. Mark, the president of Cascadia, is here as well, and it's a project that some of the rest of us have some knowledge of too. So if there are a few questions after Spencer has to leave, we can keep talking for a little bit.
Great. Thanks. So is the mic okay? Everyone can hear me? Great. So yeah, I'm going to talk about a project in Vietnam, part of the Climate Change Resilient Development Project led by USAID. And there was a workshop just earlier this week where I presented a shorter version of this presentation, and the theme of that workshop was on uptake. So a lot of us are familiar with vulnerability assessments and doing that kind of work, and I think there's an increasing interest in understanding how these things are actually being implemented now, or if they're being implemented, I guess, in some cases. And so I think Nora and John were interested in this presentation because we've actually seen some results on the ground that we wanted to share in Vietnam. So we're working at 2 different scales, both nationally and at a local level. The city of Hue is located in the middle of the country. It's a coastal town. It's about 15 kilometers from the actual coast, but it's low-lying. It's in a river basin where a number of rivers converge upstream, and so they have a lot of flooding, as does much of Vietnam. We're collaborating in Hue with the Hue Institute for Urban Planning, so they're urban planners, folks that work on urban master plans. At the national level, we're working primarily with the Ministry of Construction and an institute within or affiliated with that ministry called the Institute for Research on Rural and Urban Environment. I'm going to focus primarily on our work in Hue because that's where we've actually seen the implementation. The national program is really still midstream, so I'll return to that at the very end of the presentation and talk to you a little bit about what we're doing nationally. What's relevant to the work in Vietnam is that the federal government has actually taken regulatory action, and they have mandated certain things to occur now. And this is a recent decision that was just signed the end of last year. And they have these sort of ponderous descriptions for their legislation, decision number 2623, UDTTG. But in any event, this actually requires a number of their key cities now to develop climate adaptation plans. So that's great. So it's mandated. The critique of the legislation is a little bit vague still. It doesn't offer a lot of specificity, but it is now a mandate. And so there's an increasing momentum around doing this kind of work. So like I said, we're going to focus on an application in the field. Our original idea, and if I actually just go back 1 slide, was to work, if you see it in the box on the right, the blue box on the right, was to work in the city of Hue. It is a big tourist attraction. There's a historic citadel there that was the home of the Nguyen regime and Nguyen dynasty. But as it turns out, when we actually saw this implemented by the folks that took this on, they went to a rural area that has been slated for urban development. And this wasn't really even anticipated, which is actually a great outcome, I think, because they've been able to use the tool that was developed for the city and extend it throughout the province. In fact, that's where we've seen it implemented. So I'll talk a little bit more about that as we move through this. What I'll talk about is how and where the tool has been applied, who's using it, the successes, and then some of the challenges and limitations that we've seen so far. As I noted, the primary risk in Vietnam is flooding. This is a common occurrence. The Vietnamese are actually very well adapted to a certain amount of flooding. The city of Hue, interestingly, relies on flooding. If it doesn't flood for a season, if they go a whole year without a major flood, they actually have major water quality problems. They actually rely on the floodwaters to basically flush out the city. The city was designed to accommodate water. There's a lot of canals, and you can just see by walking around the city, for any of you that have been there, you see that, particularly around the Citadel. It's designed for the river to flood. The agriculture depends on the flooding as well. So flooding is both a blessing and a curse in its extreme forms. And as many of you probably know, climate change is providing a regime shift in flood characteristics, not just climate, but the combination of climate and land use. So where they may have seen a couple floods a year that were roughly a meter deep, now they're seeing floods with depths of 2 meters. And so it's very difficult for some of these folks to adapt to those increased depths and intensity. So the initial implementation was in this rural area called Binteng. But to understand how we wanted to implement this, we really needed to look at the historical context. There was a couple major floods. The most severe one was in 1999. There was another relatively severe flood in 2006. And again, this is a multifaceted, classic example of climate and non-climate stressors contributing to the increase in severity. And you see this list on the bottom, the concerns around deforestation, agriculture and agricultural practices, population growth. There's a lot of migration to these moderate-sized cities throughout Vietnam. And so this is something that's been studied in the area. And when we looked at our approach and this decision support tool, there's a lot of academic literature that looks at this sort of bottleneck or barrier between the production of good climate information and the uptake of it. And this is just one of many papers that have addressed that issue. This transition space between the information generation and the information needs by the decision maker. And the national academies and many people have been writing about this really for more than a decade, about this need to build this bridge between these two spaces. And so our approach is really to try to tackle that problem head on. What we do in a simple way is we synthesize 4 key types of information. We take the climate science, the projections, both at a national level and any regional information we can get our hands on. We look at the regulatory and policy environment in that area where we're deploying the tool. So that actually gets integrated explicitly into the tool. We look at adaptation practices, and I use the word good here intentionally, not best. I mean, we often talk about best practices. In the developing world, best practices sometimes aren't feasible. They're not affordable, they're just not practical. And so the word good is intentional here. We look for good practices, practices that fit the context. Those get embedded into the tool as well. And then the final piece is the spatial information, often in the form of maps. But when you assess risk, when you assess the classic vulnerability equation of exposure times sensitivity, you really need that spatial piece. So that's also part of what we leverage in this approach. And this is just one of the examples of an output screen from the tool. On the left-hand column, it's a very brief summary of the climate science information. We really strip the non-essential information out of it. What do those decision makers need? What does a project manager from a Department of Transportation, for example, need to really inform their work? So we really strip out all the non-essential information. It's just a very high-level summary of the climate science. In the middle column, we have an impact overview for that sector. So let's say, again, it's a transportation project. What does a change in temperature mean for transportation assets? So that'll be the middle column, a discussion of what those impacts are. And then the right-hand column is the policy statements, the guidance, the guidelines, recommendations, in some cases maybe even mandates. How does that local jurisdiction want to respond to these impacts? Both the center and the right-hand column, that information is co-generated with the people we're working with in country. It's their information. The tool is really a repository for that information. So we're not, USAID and its contractors are not mandating solutions on these folks. We're really working with them through the vulnerability assessment process and any other collaborative processes that generate that information. So in another simple schematic of the tool, we're really then bringing these two inputs together, the regional climate science information on the bottom, then the local knowledge in the top, so local hazard information. Those can be academic studies. For example, in Way, we took a Japanese hydrology study, integrated that into the tool that really looked at that specific river basin. We work with the local government and the agency folks to make sure that we've got the policy information correct, that that's been vetted and that they actually own that information. So those get integrated in the inputs. And then the outputs, again, are these 3 columns, which I just talked about. A brief summary of the latest climate information organized by primary climate impact, temperature, precipitation, and in this case of a coastal city, sea level rise. summary of the local impacts by sector, and then the guidelines and recommendations. So those are the outputs. Legitimacy of something like this is really reliant on the information that goes into the tool and making, again, like I said, making sure it's vetted. So we spent a lot of time researching what had been done in that region. We accessed over 48 different studies and really synthesized that information. It was a lot of work. But once we presented that back to the folks in that jurisdiction, that community, we were able to tell them, hey, we took in all of these reports that really look closely at your specific situation and integrated that into the tool. One of the most important is the one on the upper right. Those are the national climate projections that have been blessed by the Ministry of Environment within Vietnam, the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment. And because it's largely still a centrally planned country, having that sort of stamp of approval from that federal ministry is really important for them to feel that they can even use climate information. The important caveat here for those of you that have studied climate projections at all will know that scenario B2, which is what the official climate projection is not really realistic. It's a very low, very optimistic projection for future climate scenario. But that was what had been approved by the federal government. And so for our tool to have legitimacy in that community, we had to use B2 as the official top-level information we provided. However, because we had some concern that that was an overly optimistic scenario, we also included some of the other scenarios as pure information below. So they have access to a fuller picture, but if they're worried about being challenged by one of their colleagues or a legal authority, they have the official B2 projection as well. Again, on the legitimacy and making sure we had the context right, one of the first things we did was go out and we talked to some of the citizens in Hue. And this figure in the top is a gentleman showing how high the floodwaters were in the 2006 flood in his home. Pretty significant. Now, the Vietnamese are used to moving their belongings up to the second floor during flood season. This isn't necessarily a big deal to them, but if you're accommodating flood levels that are maybe waist deep and you've developed your strategies for dealing with that and all of a sudden they double, it really is a problem. And there's been a lot of loss of life and infrastructure damage in both of these major floods. And if the projections hold true, we know that things will continue to get worse. During our visit, this was just a standard rainstorm, just to get a sense of what surface water runoff looks like, and this was a mild. I mean, no one blinked an eye at this storm. So this is a screenshot of the tool that's been tailored for Hue. The map in the right-hand side is an orientation map to give folks an idea of where the different flood zones are, and this was derived from the Japanese study that I referred to earlier. But we make it really easy for the user. They have drop-down menus. So there was months of work that went into basically loading all the information into this tool, but it really takes a user 10 to 15 minutes to run through it. So once it's loaded in there by sector, we've made it really easy. And that was always the dominating factor in the design and the implementation of this tool, was to make it easy for a local government staff person. So the outputs are organized around climate impact, again, temperature changes in precipitation and sea level rise, and also by sector. In this case, this is building construction. So we have a lot of infrastructure sectors in there, roads, bridges, buildings, parks and open space. Those sectors are defined by the local jurisdiction we're working with. For example, we've also implemented this in the city of Seattle, and they had a different set of sectors. And in the national version I'll show you, it's yet another different set of sectors. So the tool has a lot of flexibility in terms of how we configure it for whichever jurisdiction we're working with. And I did want to give a nod to the overall framework that we're fitting within the CCRD. It's a development first framework. And so part of our reaching out to the community, the city, the local government initially was to really define their development objectives, which is around, really centrally around economic development and specifically tourism. Hue's a big tourist town. So a lot of the work that we did, a lot of the characterization of the impacts and also the recommendations always kept that in mind as a development objective. And this, when was this officially released, Michael? Last week. So yeah, this is hot off the press. But those of us that had been working in the field sort of had been in parallel working with this framework before it was officially released. So this is what the community looks like where the tool is first implemented. It's a rural fishing area. There's really no urban core at all yet. It's largely subsistence. Some of this fishing product is taken into Way. Um, the plan for Way is that they want to develop a lot of satellite cities around the main city, and this is being planned out of Hanoi, out of the central government. And so the planning community within this province is now being tasked with developing the first ever urban master plans for these new satellite cities. And this area will be one of those. Because it's on the coast, it's obviously exposed to typhoons and sea level rise. So the users of the tool, and really they're the owners of the tool, we went through a big training and technology transfer activity late last year, are the Way Planning Institute. They're urban planners by training. They administer the tool. They can revise the content. They can revise the maps that are in there. They have full control over the content. So as new information comes out around climate projections, for example, let's say the federal government next year releases a new set of projections, which they plan to do, these people will actually be able to update that information themselves. We have no part in that anymore. The activity was involved or informed by a broader advisory group that included the Department of Transportation, the Environment Department, Agriculture, Tourism, Construction, Storm and Flood Control, and others. And this group had been assembled by another activity. So this is an example of where we've taken an existing vulnerability assessment. USA did not fund the vulnerability assessment. That was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. We were able to take that vulnerability assessment and use that as an input for our tool. And I think this is really important for practitioners. There is a tendency to get funded and reproduce vulnerability assessments. And in fact, in the workshop earlier this week, I posed the question to everyone in the room. I said, how many of you have been funded to update an existing vulnerability assessment? There was only one person who raised their hand in the room, and he was a Vietnamese man who had been funded by somebody else. But none of the US-based folks had ever been funded to update an existing vulnerability assessment. So it's just something to think about as a practitioner. We have all these overlapping vulnerability assessments, and that is something to think about. And so we wanted to test, like, could we take someone else's work, even though it wasn't the same framework that CCRD had developed in terms of developing the vulnerability assessment, could we adapt that for our purposes in the tool? So in the lower right is a picture of the larger advisory group that included all these different government agencies. So this is really the crux of my presentation, this slide. This is the outcome. This is a climate resilient master plan. And I'll highlight a few of the key changes right here. When they originally were thinking about urban development in this area, and the coastal areas in the top side of that master plan, they were going to allow major resorts to be built. If anybody who's traveled in Vietnam and been to Da Nang, there's lots of beautiful resorts right on the beach, literally at the high tide mark. So clearly they hadn't taken into account sea level rise. They were poised to do the same thing here in this community. But one of the big things was they actually changed the zoning right along the coast. So they were preserving natural features now, some of the dune structures, and only allowing very light construction right on the beach area. So they moved all that zoning inland a bit. The other major change, so the first two items, increased coastal buffer zone and limited infrastructure types near the beach, were all part of that movement. In the center of this figure, there's that ellipse. That's a low-lying area where they were going to develop infrastructure for ecotourism. Zip lines and whatever, a bunch of other sort of activities. But through the process of going through their vulnerability assessment and loading this information into the tool, they realized that these low-lying natural features are really important for drainage, particularly when they get the flooding events and the typhoons coming through. So they actually scrapped the plan for developing ecotourism infrastructure in that central area, and they're preserving agriculture and actually forming some ponds and lakes that can be natural drainage features for this area. So really important and a great outcome. And then finally, and this is the third bullet, I'm going out of order, I apologize. The residential zones, in the lower part of the figure is a lagoon that's connected to the ocean. And they had originally zoned that for residential areas. Because it was going to be insulated from the storm surge because it's on the lagoon, but when they realized, looking at the inundation scenarios for sea level rise, that those areas would be put at risk. So they actually moved the residential zones inland. We didn't think we'd get this kind of outcome this quick. We trained them in October and November. By December, they had done this master plan. And I just learned this week that they've done 3 more. So this is just a tremendous example. I'm thrilled, and I know Nora and USAID folks are really thrilled to get this kind of uptake this quickly. From going from a vulnerability assessment to us configuring and training them on this tool to them actually using it in the field. Now, admittedly, the truest test will be when these are actually constructed. So will they conform to the master plans? When big money comes into areas like this, things tend to happen in their own way. So I think it'll be important for us to continue to watch what happens in this area to make sure that these plans are actually followed. So the other master plan was done just nearby in the next district that was going to be developed. And then these two others, which again, I just learned about, and I'm not even sure where they are on the map. I just got the names yesterday. So they've done a total of 4 master plans now. They're also targeting the city, which is what our original intent was with the tool. We had customized it for the city of Way. And so they are starting to do this now. And the director of the Way Planning Institute showed this slide. These are his slides now from the workshop earlier this week of what they're going to try to do with the new Way Master Plan. So that'll be then a 5th example of using the tool. This is one of the 4 I'd mentioned earlier, just a satellite image of the site. You can see the lagoon in the left-hand image. And then the topography is pretty diverse through this area. That's the opening in the right-hand image. That's the opening between the ocean and the lagoon. So it's tidally influenced. Lots of aquaculture goes on in that lagoon. It's the largest lagoon in Southeast Asia, in fact. Lagoon. This is the tool in Vietnamese. We actually had it translated. Obviously, they don't use it in English. We develop it in English so we can actually understand it. And then we have the whole thing translated into Vietnamese. And they've actually updated some of the maps. So this is a version of the tool for one of the other areas, and they actually went in and updated that map. We did not have any participation in that. So now they're taking, in conjunction with the tool, they're taking their spatial data. I mentioned spatial data as one of the key components, and connecting that back to the tool information. So this is an example of a flood map that they're using now in conjunction with the tool. Not only are flood depths important, but the rate at which the water leaves once it floods, so the drainage maps, very important. And then resulting from that and the use of the tool, they've developed this as one of the other master plans, and this is the zoning configuration, where they've identified different types of land uses. Again, along these same principles of maintaining natural drainage, making sure that residences are not in harm's way, and making sure that their major infrastructure also is not in harm's way. This is just a zoom of one of the specific, I think, residential or commercial areas. So this is their slide, the Vietnamese slide, of what they need to do to improve. And I thought it would be useful just to look at their perspective on this. And I saw this for the first time just yesterday. So what could be done to improve? They highlighted these 4 things. Need a long-term visioning and planning for the urban future. And I think this is a realization that they have not systemically integrated climate thinking into their urban planning. This is one of the very few examples in Vietnam where they're doing it. And I think, this is his call out probably to his colleagues that we need to integrate this throughout our urban planning framework. They mentioned the safe failure approach for infrastructure, which is a pretty well understood concept. So anyways, I won't go through these in detail, but they're already looking forward. What do they need to do to continue to move the ball forward? And I think that's really encouraging. From our perspective, we did also see some challenges and limitations, and I wanted to highlight a few of those. The tool was developed not to just be used by urban planners, but it was also developed to be used by the other departments that were part of that advisory group. So the Department of Transportation, the Department of Construction, a few others. It's only being used by urban planners right now. That's sort of okay. If we just had to pick one group to use it, it would have been the urban planners, because that's really one of the best opportunities to influence how these cities look like in the future. But it's not being used as fully as it could be, and that's a disappointment. And there's a couple possible explanations. One is that, not unlike in any other country, once an organization has something of value, they tend to hoard it because it elevates their stature among their peers. And so I think that's part of the dynamic. When you ask them, they say, well, it's difficult, we don't have time, we would like to do that, we don't have funding to coordinate. So there's a lot of explanation along those lines. But in reality, we've observed that they have been elevated. This is a new director of this institute. I think he's getting, understandably and rightfully so, some good attention for this work. We would love for him to share this tool with the Department of Transportation and with some of the other colleagues in local government. So how do we facilitate that expansion of its use? It's a question. A related bullet. So maybe it is a resource constraint. I mean, maybe they actually do need funding for a staff person to coordinate the use of the tool, to maintain it. I don't want to discount the validity of that claim. They've been doing this on their own dime. We haven't provided them any funding for staff. That's really, they've just added this onto their existing duties. So, AID might not be the right organization that can do that funding, but as we think about it, this collectively, like how do we build in sort of a sustainable system so these folks can continue to implement solutions like this? What do they need? It may be personnel, it may be staff capacity, and how is that funded? The other big challenge through this project, and it's even more so at the national level, is data sharing. Again, it's this concept of hoarding information that has value. We're seeing this in spades at the national level. We want to build a common IT platform so the spatial data can be shared across entities. That's proved to be very difficult. Everyone wants to charge each other for data, even amongst partner agencies. So not a new problem, and I know this problem arises in a lot of other countries as well, but we're seeing this as definitely a hurdle. So ideally, not only in the rural areas would we like to see this applied, but we want to see this applied in the urban core and to see how that works in a situation where you've got existing infrastructure that's being revamped or remodeled. How can the tool actually apply in an existing urban core? And so I think there will be an opportunity in a way where they start to look at the city proper, the existing city, as they work with the tool. There's been some communication pieces developed, and I just wanted to highlight that. This is not the approved one, but I like it because our folks developed it. There's going to be a USAID one that will be approved shortly, a 2-pager. So if you want access to the 2-pager, I would connect with Nora, and she can let you know how to get access to that communications piece. I'm going to talk just briefly with the next 10 or 15 minutes about the tool, dig into a little bit more depth so you can see actually the architecture and how it functions. There's 3 objectives when we designed the tool. And again, it was first deployed in the city of Seattle, and I'll talk a little bit about how it's been applied in Seattle as well. The #1 overriding objective is that it's quick and simple. I used to work in state government, and even within the US, I would always hear complaints from my city and county colleagues that, oh, it's great, all this climate information, we have no idea how to use it. What do we do with, a projection out to 2050 that is A1 to A1, what is that? I don't understand. So they just didn't really know how to access the information, even in North America. So you can imagine the developing world is the same problem. So every decision point that I reached where we had to make a decision about the architecture of the tool, if it wasn't improving its simplicity, clarity, and relevance, then it was not the good choice. So we always deferred to the choice of quick and simple. The second objective was that we wanted to consolidate as much information as we could from the overriding set of information into one location so people weren't having to go to multiple sources. So as much as that was practical, we consolidated and made it comprehensive. And then finally, we wanted it to be flexible so it could be tailored and customized for the context and the jurisdiction we were working with. So as I mentioned, simplicity. 5 simple steps, really 4 steps that the user interfaces with, and then they get an output. 10 to 15 minutes, you can work through it. I mentioned climate information. So this is an example of what our summary might be for changes in temperature. We really strip away the non-essential information. We feel it's important to report the full range because it really is up to a subjective risk determination about where you want to operate within that range. But this is the sort of type of information, the language we use in the tool in terms of a science summary. We allowed the user to pick their time horizon. So some projects maybe only need to last 10 or 15 years or 20 years. So we don't necessarily want folks over-designing if they don't need to. There's a cost benefit, obviously, with that. So we allow the user to pick their time horizon. That's the drop down that allows them to do that. And so as we look towards the national tool, we're doing this for every province, all 53 provinces in the country. And this is the form, that table is the form of the data we got from the Vietnamese ministry. This is just a spatial representation, a map of changes in temperature. This is a figure from the National Academy of Sciences. This was a seminal report released a few years ago that shows, we're all familiar with this figure now. I think we've all seen 400 permutations of this diagram in one form or another. The reason I show it now is what we wanted to do when I mentioned being comprehensive is we wanted to capture as much of this full cycle as we could within the tool. And that was really one of the other goals. And so we think we were successful in getting about 5.5 steps. And the fact that we do see now this implementation, these master plans, we do feel now validated in saying that we did get part of step 5. The existing vulnerability assessment came in here, and to me that was as significant as anything else that we had done in this project, as we actually were able to, again, use an existing vulnerability assessment as an input. Using the CCRD diagram, this is a similar sort of figure. Again, we think we're capturing these first 4 steps in the tool in one form or another. So these are screenshots of both the Way tool and the Seattle tool. This is a better view of the output, one of the output screens. Again, there's one for each temperature, precipitation, and sea level rise. The left-hand column is the statement of the science. This column on sensitivity is in the Seattle tool. It's not in the Way tool. This is a risk assessment approach where it provides guidance to the user where they need to operate within that range. So if the change in temperatures, let's say, is, well, in this case, it's 1.1 to 3.3. If it's a highly sensitive project, either it's very expensive or it has big impacts for human health or human safety, the user may select high sensitivity. And then the city would say, okay, if it's a high sensitivity project, we want to operate at the 95th percentile value within that range. That's a policy choice that we facilitate in our conversation. We don't choose that for them. If it's a medium sensitivity project, maybe the city would say, we'll operate at the 75th percentile value within that range. And if it's a low sensitivity project, to save costs, maybe they operate at the average or the 25th percentile. That's up to them, but that's what the sensitivity module allows for, is to actually have some reliability and repeatability in terms of how people are choosing a value within that range. We did not deploy that within the Way context. Again, the impact overviews and the guidance information are generated with the jurisdiction. Those reflect their understanding of the problems and their recommendations for addressing them. This is an example of one of the maps in the Way tool. This is the flood map that was used. And a user will simply go to this map, and if there are project areas within one of these zones, they simply select that from a drop-down menu. This is a graphical representation of how all this information is integrated within the tool. So on the left-hand side, this is the information that we have loaded up for the user, the regional climate projections, any hazard maps. Ideally, we hyperlink to a GIS system, but they didn't have one in Way. In the city of Seattle, we really just provide a hyperlink to the city's GIS system, where they have a custom view of the climate change relevant layers. So a user will go to that, their own tool, but it'll only show sea level rise inundation layers, landslide zones, floodplains. If we have urban heat data, that could be reflected as well. The user is the center column here in this figure, and they're selecting the region, the lifespan they're interested in, their location by referencing those hazard maps, which sector they're interested in examining, and then within Vietnam, within the national project, what type of planning activity they're involved in. So all of this is programmed within the tool, and then you get the outputs, which we talked about. So really briefly, the Seattle tool was very similar. It's a prior version, so it doesn't look as pretty, but this was our very first implementation. And the drop-downs, the sectors that they chose were all infrastructure. So bridges, new buildings, retrofit buildings, drainage systems, electricity distribution and transmission, parks and open space, and right-of-way, which includes roads and other things like that. So that was the City of Seattle tool. Again, very familiar. The user can choose their lifespan. We looked at all of the downstream risks from a primary climate impact. So, for example, transportation infrastructure. But we looked at all of these type of secondary impacts that would result from sea level rise. And so a user, like I said, would go to a hyperlink and go to a GIS system, look at their project location and see whether or not it was in a zone or out of a zone. It's a binary choice, so it's very quick for the user to make that determination. And then one of the implementations in the city of Seattle was we have a lot of drawbridges. For those of you that haven't been to the city, it's also a very water-dominated community. And a lot of our drawbridges are very old, and so a number of them are going through major retrofits. And the engineering team that was doing this work used the tool to determine that the actual expansion joints they were planning to install were not sufficient for the new temperature range. So they used the new temperature range that was provided in the tool to redesign those expansion joints. So again, a really nice example, very practical example of how this can be used in the field. Finally, I have 2 slides, I think, on the national project, and I'm not going to dwell on this because we're sort of really just in the initial stages of this, but this is a very ambitious project, admittedly. It's an experiment to see if we can pull this off. We want to abstract the concept of applying this at a city level and to see if we can actually create a generic version that applies to an entire country. It's a huge undertaking on our part to do this, but we have very willing partners at the federal level in Vietnam within the Ministry of Construction. Nora's going to get to see this firsthand in a few days' time. But this includes over 760 towns, 58 provinces, 5 centrally controlled cities like Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City. Looking at all of the major planning activities throughout the country, so regional planning, general planning, detailed and zoning planning, and then the specialized infrastructure planning for all of these sectors. So all of this information is, as we speak, being, well, I guess they just arrived in Vietnam, so they're not doing it right now, but is being loaded into a big database that will then inform the tables in the tool. So we're going big on this one to see if we can pull it off, but I think we're going to learn a lot in the process regardless. And so this is with the initial mock-up of the national tool, where a user will now be able to select their province or city, and then within that, the sub-cities and towns. The challenge is those of you that dabble in climate science will know that the granularity of the climate data isn't always great at the city level. So really, we're constrained with provincial level data. And as you saw in one of the photographs, the topography is pretty varied in some of these locations where you have mountainous areas going all the way down to a coastal zone. So being able to intellectually, honestly, sort of convey that information where we're not misleading people is one of the challenges. The federal ministry is coming out with a finer grid scale set of projections next, I think it's this summer or maybe this fall. So that'll be updated into the tool and that's available. But anyways, I just wanted to make sure I was clear about that. And so I think with that, it's almost right on time in terms of my estimate. I've got about 20 minutes to stick around and chat. And this is the contact information. Mark O'Donnell, our president's here as well. So I'd encourage you to reach out to him. But I'm happy to ask any or answer any questions that you may want to ask. Yeah, Nora. Yeah.
Hello.
So in the community where they did the master plan and they were able to change locations of different pretty easily, do you know if there were any project developers already involved, like with the potential ecotourism sites
Right.
that had to accept a change, or?
We, not to our knowledge. In fact, the indication was that it was very easy for them to redefine those zones because they were far enough upstream in the process. And I don't think anyone had made any investments yet in terms of purchasing land. But I think that's a question on this next trip that'll be important to ask. You know, has any foreign investment come into these areas yet, and how are they communicating with those either potential investors or folks that have already made investment? I suspect that they had not, and that's why it was so easy for them to make the changes in this case. Yeah, good question.
Yeah. So when and some of them mentioned to me that after the flood of 1999, some hydropower were built upstream of the Hue province. and that had an impact. And some people say that it has helped with the flooding. They don't see as much flooding as before. And then some other people say that, well, like the hydropower plant, like when the rainy season comes, sometimes like they release water while like it is raining heavily, and it contributes to more flooding. And then similarly, like another non-climate stressor is like the construction. Um, some people mentioned that like in the richer part of the Hue City, people have been building like a lot like taller buildings, and that result in more flooding in the poorer, like less built up areas. So I'm just wondering if you took into account like this kind of information in your tool,
Yeah.
and especially in the climate hazard mapping.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So I referred to the Japanese hydrology study that we used. That was done, I think, in 2012. And they did indeed take into account land use and reservoir operation. And I've heard both stories as well, that in some cases the reservoirs mitigated flood risk. In other cases, there is a belief that they actually exacerbated flood risk. And again, anecdotally, what I've been told is that the community was told that the reservoirs would be used as a flood control means, but they're hydropower dams. They're generating electricity. And so I've also been told in reality they're being operated totally to optimize revenue generation from electricity sales. So they're maximizing their water levels even near a the rainy season. And so that obviously then would worsen the risk. And this, I think, plays out all over the world now where you're seeing dams go in. This is a very common dilemma for communities that don't have a lot of influence over who's operating those dams. Right now, the Army Corps of Engineers is working in this river basin with the flood and storm control folks to develop a reservoir operational model that helps them be at least a little more conscious of the risk they may be creating. The second question you asked was related to, remind me. Oh, right, yeah. So this is a problem throughout Vietnam, in fact, not just in Hue. So because many of these cities are in a very low-lying, flat delta area, and they flood, people know that, well, if I build my house at so-and-so elevation, I'll be fine. The water will come through, it'll be waist deep or whatever, and I can manage. But now with these deeper floods that are starting to occur, people are elevating the underlying land around these new developments, and she's exactly right. What it's doing is just pushing that water to their neighbors. So they're going to be safe, but you're just pushing the flooding around to other locations. Modeling that type of behavior is very difficult. It's not impossible to do with a fine-scale hydrology model. And the Japanese study did look at land use decisions around elevation as well in the floodplain. But all the scenarios that they ran in terms of looking at variations of that were all very optimistic. More trees are going to be planted and restoration of ecosystems. They didn't actually look at any sort of more pessimistic scenarios. So we were a little bit concerned with that study. Now, obviously, our project didn't have the funding to redo the hydrology analysis. So what we did was simply take their sort of worst case scenario and create the hazard zones and allowed people to determine if they were in that zone. And part of the process was putting those maps on the wall as we were working away and allowing people that live there to come and draw on them. And so we made some modifications based on actually local input about where people knew the real hazards were. But I think that's an ongoing process for sure.
Hi, Steve Perez from Chemonics International. My question is also in relation to the city master plan that was created. To what extent was there community engagement in making the decisions that were made? And if there was community engagement, what did that look like?
Yeah. We were not there for that. So we were told there was extensive community engagement, that they interviewed the people. It's a commune, so it's a rural area, that they did interview them. But we weren't there to witness that, so I can't speak firsthand how that went. And maybe we have some comments on urban planning in Vietnam since she's from there. Our understanding is that there is still a little bit of a top-down, we're going to build a city here, and this is more or less how it's going to look. But then sort of the fine-tuning of that is informed by local input. But I don't think the folks that are fishermen in this village say, oh, we want an urban core in our neighborhood. That wasn't their decision, I don't think. That was centrally planned. But I do believe that they're pretty good about gathering local input. Do you have any other thoughts or experiences directly on how that process may or may not work?
My experience is that they usually like they do interview some residents, but like it's very centrally planned at the city level or at the national level, and the people don't really have a lot of say.
Joseph Karam with EcoDit. Thank you for this presentation. It sounds like a very complex tool. Um, is it fair to say it's an input-output type tool or model? It, clearly, it uses a number of models like hydrologic models. You mentioned that, but and one of the outputs seems to be flood areas, flood maps. Can you summarize what types of inputs, models, and outputs are key to
Sure.
this
The tool itself is actually very simple at the highest level of abstraction. It's really a repository. There's no algorithms. Well, there's a few, but not that is doing any processing. We're not projecting. We're not doing any climate data processing. We're really gathering that information. We're doing some interpolation between some of the data sets. But it's really, again, we're consolidating all the available information. We're not creating new analysis. So we're using existing analysis, whether it's a hydrology study or climate projections, that gets loaded into the tool. And then all we've done is really made it very, very simple to access this information. So for example, it no longer is a desk study to do a vulnerability assessment on a particular project. This tool basically consolidates all those reports and all those studies in one location and then outputs the information for the users. So there isn't a complex algorithm. We're not calculating, cubic feet per minute flow in a particular part of the city. That's already been done in another study, and we've just brought that in together into this tool.
Same with like flood maps and all of that.
Absolutely.
You assume this work has been done, and you're just putting it in the
We
system.
leverage whatever is available for a particular jurisdiction. So in another city, if they didn't do a hydrology study, we wouldn't be able to say much about flood depth. We would be able to make some qualitative statements about increases in precipitation based on the outputs of a climate model, but we wouldn't be able to say anything about flood depth. If there's a hydrology study that's been done, we will put that into the tool.
Alex Grace with Winnock International. So if you don't have local data, for instance, do you then revert back to IPCC assessments, et cetera, or you just rely on the ability to have local information?
Good question. Everywhere we've worked so far, we've had some type of local assessment that's been available. Local, in this case, national. And I think there's enough folks out there that are generating regional projections or downscaled results that I don't think there's that many places where you'd solely be reliant on, a crude grid cell scale output from an IPCC assessment type data. Again, it's important to emphasize there's a lot of people that have generated downscaled data for Vietnam, but none of those were approved by the federal government except their collaborative project with CSIRO out of Australia. So they were the scientific experts that came in and helped Vietnam generate their climate projections. And those have the stamp of approval. Now we recognize there are quote unquote, it's arguable or debatable that there's better climate data for this region, but those wouldn't have legitimacy. So they may be better in our eyes as climate scientists or practitioners, but it would be irrelevant to put that in there because no one would feel comfortable using them. So and our philosophy is that it's more important to get people in the habit of using climate information to inform their decisions than having the perfect set of climate data at this stage. Now they have the tool, and presumably as they continue to evolve in their thinking, in another year they'll have a new set of climate information. They'll already have been using this tool to know how to use it, and then it's just a matter of updating the climate projections in the tool. So that's been our philosophy in this approach.
Hi, Spencer. Thanks for the great presentation.
Hi, Joe.
I'm Joe Casola from Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. I wonder if you could comment a little bit in the framework, distinguishing, or to the extent you can, kind of existing climate risks versus the future climate risks that kind of come off the projections. I can imagine some things like wind damage from a typhoon. Projection-wise, we may not be able to say much, but it's an important risk. So yeah, I wonder if you could talk about that.
Yeah, and you notice in intentional absence of the word wind in any of our slides because of the difficulty in projecting. It does enter the existing, if we have historical data that's really relevant and salient to the questions we're asking, that will be included. In fact, the Seattle tool, we have a lot of historical information as well. A lot of the flood data that was modified by the locals was based on historical experience. You know, where do they know existing flood risks exist? So it's absolutely critical. In fact, I think it would be fair to argue it's maybe even more important to include the historical information. So we do try to do that wherever we can, where it makes sense, to combine that with the projections and make sure that they're not, you know, in some cases you can get conflicting trends between your historical data set, particularly at the resolution of a province, what the climate projections are saying. So I think it's something that we continually try to evaluate as we load information into the tool. You know, if we have historical data, what is that saying? What story is that telling? How does that map on to our storyline around the projections as well? So yeah, it's a great question. It's a really important part of this kind of work. But wind is something, and we, you know, in retrospect, maybe we could have included some qualitative statements about wind. Like you said, wind is often associated with the typhoons, and there's a lot of wind damage. We did not include that because we didn't have any, I guess, reliable or consistent story around wind that at least made sense to us to include in the tool. So I would say it's, you know, its absence is noteworthy because wind is a significant hazard for sure.
More questions?
Hi, Spencer. It's Mike Carty from Agility. Two questions. The first is, how did you, because you're in the U.S., you worked with Seattle, City of Seattle. How did you end up picking this city, Hue, and then there's other cities? That's the first thing. So, was there some need from their perspective? Is there like a population boom happening, construction boom? That's the first question. And then, totally separate, you said you're doing the experiment of applying this to 270 communities and also ministries, it looks like, graphic. How is that going to be going forward? Across any pushback, or how's that, who are you working with?
I'll take those in reverse order. We were abstracting the tool so it is applicable to the entire country. We're going to test drive that in two new cities, Cantu and Vung Tau, which are both near the Mekong region. And so we won't be rolling it out across the entire country. We're going to try. We're not going to tailor it for those two cities. We're going to develop it for the entire country and then go to those two cities and see how it plays out in those two cities with a minimal amount of outreach and a minimal amount of training and see if they can actually use it. So that's sort of the test, the experiment, if you will. And if that goes well, then we basically hand over the tool to the Ministry of Construction, and they can then deploy it wherever they want throughout the country. So it's the Ministry of Construction, really two affiliated institutes, the Vietnam Institute for Urban Planning and the Institute for Rural and Urban Environment are the two institutes we're working with, but they're affiliated with the Ministry of Construction. And this, again, you get into dueling ministries. The Ministry of Environment is ostensibly the ministry that's in charge of climate work in Vietnam, but they really don't have control of the purse strings. They're not doing things on the ground per se. It's the Ministry of Construction where you're really going to get the biggest bang for your buck in our mind in terms of affecting the way that the cities are developed throughout the country. The reason Hue was chosen was actually partly a result of your boss's input, Glenn Anderson. He and a few other folks that have been working in this space helped us in a conference call pick a city that was lined up to do a vulnerability assessment, had some awareness around climate change already, and was a medium-sized city in Asia. And the reason that the size was important is that that's where the opportunity exists to really influence the future architecture, the future sort of manifestation of that city. Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh City, Shanghai, Beijing, those are already built out largely. And so the opportunity to really fundamentally influence how those cities evolve would be very limited. Not insignificant, not unimportant, but there's a real attraction to medium-sized cities that are seeing a big influx of population right now. And so that was another factor for Hue to be chosen as a medium-sized city that's going to be experiencing a lot of growth. Yeah.
What's the generality of the tool? I understand that you've elaborated it in this case, but
Yeah.
taken and applied to Jamaica.
Absolutely.
Or would
And the gentleman behind you would be happy to help you do that. Yeah, no, it was designed intentionally. So we first deployed it in the city of Seattle, but when from the very beginning of this project, and we invested some of our own money to do this, we wanted to create an architecture that was extendable, that you could modify for any jurisdiction in the world. So it was built with that in mind, so it could be deployed wherever there might be a need. Yeah. Again, he can help you with that as well. No, we have some documents for sure. There's a user's guide that we've developed for the Way version, so it'll be more germane to the version that we deployed in Way Vietnam, but it'll give you a very good idea of how the tool functions and how a user interfaces with it. Mm-hmm. It's an excellent question. This question came up a couple days ago when we were talking about this. I gave a similar presentation in this workshop. In my opinion, and Mark may not want me to say this, but I don't think this tool is applicable in places without governance. I mean, there's some floor level amount of good governance you have to have this tool even make sense. If you go into an area where it's really, things are being decided on the neighborhood level, this tool probably doesn't make sense. You really need some type of functioning government where there's some reliable enforcement, code enforcement, and those kind of things. And Vietnam was another factor that led to the selection of Vietnam is actually has a very functioning government. I mean, not without some controversy in certain areas, but compared to a lot of other developing countries, they've got a pretty good handle on government operations. So I think there is some antecedent conditions in terms of good governance that's really important.
So we're going to let Spencer get
Yeah.
to the airport.
Great.
Thank you very much,
Yeah,
Spencer.
thanks a lot.
And we'll see if Mark can stay for a few minutes in case there's any other questions. And as usual, the next event will be the third Thursday of the month.